The blizzard clawed at the lone cabin, a white shroud smothering the world outside. Inside, beneath a rough wool blanket, a woman lay shivering, the chill not entirely from the biting air. Her ribs ached with a deep, bruising pain, a stark reminder of the fall into the ravine. Fear, cold and sharp, was a constant companion, whispering of exposure, wolves, and the relentless pursuit that had driven her into the wilderness in the first place. Days had blurred into a frozen nightmare, every step a gamble against exhaustion and the gnawing dread of discovery. She had stumbled, collapsed, certain the end had come, only for a shadow to fall over her in the swirling snow. He had been a figure of stark, imposing silence against the white chaos, a man whose weathered face held the rugged lines of the unforgiving landscape. Not cruel, though his eyes held a wary detachment. He had simply lifted her, a burden of ice and bone, and carried her through the storm. Now, in the dim light of a crackling fire, his presence filled the small cabin, a silent, formidable anchor in her storm of pain and terror. He moved with a quiet efficiency, tending the fire, melting snow for water, his movements economical and strong. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand explanation. He simply existed, a stoic guardian against the elements and whatever unseen threats she carried with her. Her name, she had managed to whisper, was Alara. It felt fragile on her chapped lips, a sound almost lost in the wind's howl. He had nodded, a slow, measured dip of his head, and introduced himself as Silas. Nothing more. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken histories and present anxieties. She watched him, wary as a cornered animal, her mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. Was he a trapper? A rancher? Did he live alone? Would he turn her away once the storm passed? Would he know who she was? The questions spun, tangled with the throbbing in her side and the raw ache in her heart. The cabin offered scant comfort beyond the fire's warmth. It was spare, functional, built for utility, not ease. A single cot, a rough-hewn table, shelves holding simple supplies. It mirrored the man, necessary without embellishment. He offered her a mug of warm broth, holding it steady as her trembling hands reached for it. The warmth spread through her, a fragile dam against the internal cold. Their fingers brushed, a brief, electric contact that made her flinch internally, a lifetime of caution ingrained. He seemed not to notice or perhaps chose not to acknowledge it. His gaze was direct when it met hers, but devoid of judgment or undue curiosity. It was the gaze of a man accustomed to observing the natural world, accepting its harshness without surprise. This absence of invasive questioning was, perhaps, the first flicker of unexpected mercy she had encountered in months. It allowed her a fragile space to simply be, to hurt and to heal without the immediate pressure to explain, to justify, to lie. The wind outside screamed its fury, but within the cabin's thick walls, a precarious quiet settled, punctuated only by the fire and their shared breaths. She closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her down, the image of his silhouette against the firelight the last thing she saw before sleep claimed her. Days bled into a slow, arduous rhythm of recovery. Alara remained a creature of shadow and silence, watching Silas from the cot, her body gradually reclaiming its strength, her mind still a battlefield of fear. He maintained his stoic distance, providing food, clean water, fresh bandages for her ribs, his movements purposeful and unhurried. He spent his days outside, tending to unseen tasks, chopping wood, checking fences buried under snow, his presence a constant, quiet reassurance that felt both alien and necessary. He spoke little, and when he did, it was about the weather, the state of the cabin's supplies, simple, practical things. He never asked about her journey, her injuries, her past. This deliberate silence was a balm, a stark contrast to the relentless questioning and suspicion she had fled. She began to observe him more closely. He wasn't a cruel man. His hands, though calloused and strong, were gentle when he changed her bandages. He left her food within reach, ensured the fire never died completely through the night. There was a solitude about him that resonated with her own enforced isolation, a sense of deep-seated self-reliance born of necessity. He seemed comfortable in the vast emptiness of the landscape, a part of its silence rather than someone fighting against it. Hesitantly, she began to test the boundaries of this fragile sanctuary. One afternoon, when he was outside, she pushed herself up from the cot, her muscles protesting, her head swimming. She took a few shaky steps, clutching the table for support. The simple act of standing felt monumental. When Silas returned, he found her standing by the window, looking out at the endless white. He paused, his gaze resting on her for a moment longer than usual, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, not surprise, perhaps acceptance. He didn't comment, didn't scold. He simply went about his work. The next day, she managed to walk a short distance outside, bundled in a coat he had left for her. The cold air bit at her lungs, but the feeling of the snow crunching underfoot was invigorating. She saw the tracks of deer, a fox. The world, despite the storm, was alive. Back inside, she found herself instinctively tidying a corner of the cabin, folding a blanket, stacking firewood neatly. Small, domestic acts that she hadn't allowed herself in years. When Silas saw, he merely inclined his head. "Good," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Helps keep the cabin tight." It wasn't praise, but it wasn't rejection either. It was acceptance of her presence, her small contribution. The silence between them was no longer just a void of unspoken fears, but a space where tentative trust could grow, slow and fragile as a seedling pushing through frozen ground. She still didn't speak of her past, the shadowed life she had led, the skills she possessed that were so far removed from this quiet, elemental existence. But the tightness in her chest began to ease, replaced by a different kind of tension, the quiet vigilance of a survivor finding a temporary haven. As Alara's strength returned, so did a restless energy. The cabin felt less like a prison and more like a temporary shelter. She began to assist Silas with small tasks, preparing food, mending a torn piece of fabric, helping sort supplies. Her movements were precise, economical, reflecting a lifetime of ingrained discipline. Silas noticed. He didn't comment, but his gaze lingered sometimes, a quiet assessment. He brought in injured wildlife occasionally, a bird with a broken wing, a rabbit caught in a snare. Alara, to her own surprise, found herself able to tend to them, her hands surprisingly deft. She knew certain poultices from foraging, had an innate understanding of anatomy that felt almost instinctual. She kept these skills close, revealing them only through action, never explanation. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon, a dark smudge against the snow. Alara froze, every muscle tensing, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't just fear. It was a primal terror that spoke of capture, of consequences she couldn't bear to face. She ducked instinctively, pressing herself against the back wall of the cabin, out of sight of the window. Silas, watching her, saw the raw panic in her eyes, the sudden, animalistic need to conceal herself. He didn't question it. He simply stepped between her and the window, shielding her from view with his own large frame. The rider was a neighbor, a grizzled man named Jeb, seeking help with a calving emergency. Silas spoke to him outside, his voice low and steady, deflecting Jeb's casual questions about who he had inside. Alara listened from the shadows, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. When Jeb finally rode away, Silas returned, the cold air clinging to him. He looked at Alara, still huddled against the wall, her face pale. "He's gone," he said simply. He didn't press her about her reaction, didn't demand an explanation for her terror. But the silence between them had shifted again. Her secret, or at least the depth of her fear, was no longer entirely her own. He had seen it, accepted it without judgment, and silently protected her. It was a powerful, unspoken exchange. That night, the wind howled with renewed ferocity, shaking the cabin. A fierce storm was coming, worse than the last. Silas checked the shutters, reinforced the door. The urgency in his movements was palpable. Alara watched him, a different kind of tension filling her, Not just fear for herself, but a quiet concern for this man who had given her refuge. She noticed details he seemed to overlook in his haste. A loose latch on a window frame, a draft coming from under the door. Small things, but significant in a blizzard. She pointed them out, her voice quiet but firm. He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but he checked where she indicated and made the necessary adjustments. In that moment, the dynamic shifted again. They were no longer rescuer and rescued, but two people facing a shared threat, each bringing their own observations, their own strengths, to the task of survival. The storm hit with the force of a physical blow, battering the cabin, the wind a relentless, shrieking presence. Snow piled against the door and windows, threatening to bury them alive. A large section of the roof began to groan under the weight, timbers protesting, ice cracking. "It won't hold," Silas yelled over the din, his face grim. Water began to seep through, dripping onto the floor. Panic threatened to resurface in Alara, but looking at Silas, she saw not despair, but a fierce determination. He was already moving, assessing the weakest points. There was a dangerous task ahead, reinforcing the roof from the inside, a risky maneuver in the raging storm. He needed to climb into the small, narrow space between the ceiling and the outer roof, a space she knew instinctively was too small for his frame. Her mind raced, not with fear for herself, but with cold, calculated assessment. The structure, the strain, the potential collapse. Her past, a life she had tried so hard to bury, resurfaced with sudden, sharp clarity. Years of training, of discipline, of skills honed in the shadows, surged through her. She knew structures, knew leverage, knew how to move in confined, perilous spaces. "You can't fit," she said, her voice cutting through the storm's roar, strong and clear. Silas looked at her, surprised by the change in her demeanor, the hesitant fear replaced by a focused intensity. "I can," she stated, stepping forward. "Show me where. Tell me what you need." He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. What he saw wasn't the terrified woman he had found, but someone else entirely, someone capable and resolute. He nodded, a slow, acknowledging gesture. Together, they worked, Silas directing from below, Alara maneuvering herself into the cramped, dark space, her body moving with an unexpected grace and precision. She identified the failing timbers, used the bracing materials he passed up with an expert hand, her knowledge of joinery and stress points manifesting in quick, efficient actions. The cold was intense, the work grueling, but the focus was absolute. She was no longer Alara the fugitive, but Alara, a master craftswoman, a builder of hidden things, a fixer of broken structures. It was a part of her she had thought destroyed, yet here it was vital and strong. Hours later, exhausted and shaking, she dropped back down into the cabin, the storm still raging, but the groan of the roof silenced. Silas looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, quiet awe. He didn't need to ask. He had seen. The woman who had arrived broken and terrified possessed skills that spoke of a life far removed from hardship, a life of intricate work, of hidden artistry. He saw the strength in her eyes, the dignity that had replaced the fear. The storm eventually subsided, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. The cabin stood firm, a testament to their combined effort. Alara's past remained largely unspoken, a shadow that lingered but no longer defined her entirely. She had shown her true strength, not through words, but through action, through the quiet revelation of who she was beneath the layers of fear and hardship. Silas, the silent, capable rancher, had provided the refuge, the space to heal, but she had rebuilt herself, piece by careful piece, using the forgotten skills of her past. They stood by the window, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered peaks in hues of rose and gold. The future was uncertain. The world outside still held dangers, but the fear that had once consumed her had receded, replaced by a quiet determination. She had found not just shelter, but a recognition of her own worth, a partnership built on respect and shared resilience. The harsh land had not broken her. Instead, it had revealed the unbreakable core within. She was a Lara, survivor, builder, woman of unexpected strength, standing tall against the dawn, no longer defined by her flight, but by her capacity to endure, to build, to find light even in the deepest shadows.